Hello, everyone. This is your host, Philip Reiner, and welcome to the inaugural podcast of Technology for Global Security, where I serve as the executive director. I'm a retired Pentagon civil servant, where I spent almost a decade working in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy, and in my last role in federal service, I was the senior director for South Asia on President Obama's National Security Council staff. I wanted to welcome you to The Fourth Leg. This is a series of podcasts focused on one of the most complex systems in the world today, nuclear command and control, and its increasingly complicated future. Within this series, we're going to go straight to the experts across multiple sectors to talk about the modernization of nuclear command and control systems. Keep an eye on Technology for Global Security in the coming weeks and months as we begin to launch additional podcast series focused on how to fix the internet, AI and global security, and other critical technology and security related issues. For now, we have so much to talk about. Let's get started. We spoke with Dr. Ron Schouten, who is the Director of the Law and Psychiatric Service of the Massachusetts General Hospital and Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He's served as a teacher, a consultant to businesses, and also as an expert witness in both civil and criminal matters over time. Dr. Schouten has also served as a subject matter expert for the Biological Threat Classification Program for DHS and has testified before the Congressional Subcommittee on the Prevention of Nuclear and Biological Attack. Ron, it's really great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for making time out of your busy schedule for us.
Thanks for having me.
We've had the opportunity to interview a pretty broad range of folks on the podcast. It's fascinating to have you on coming to this with the background that you have, the experiences that you've had over the years dealing with the issues that we're going to talk about here today. I thought what might be really critical for listeners is to kind of let you give folks a sense of your expertise when it comes to insider threats, where you come from, and how that begins to tie you into the discussion that we pulled you into in January when it comes to nuclear command and control.
Well, oddly enough, I started my career as an employment lawyer. That lasted about a year. I went back to school, went to medical school, and ended up pursuing psychiatry, became a forensic psychiatrist under the influence of our department chairman. And that combination of forensic psychiatry and employment law practice put me in a position where I was talking with a lot of labor and employment lawyers right around the time that workplace violence became a big issue. So I started doing a lot of those evaluations and consultations and got involved in the field of threat assessment and management. And as for many of us after 9/11, a lot of things changed, and I started to be drawn into consultation with organizations and then with the government around crisis response and terrorism. So in 2008, I was involved with the ODNI's SHARP program, the Summer Hard Problem Program on bioterrorism. And then in 2009, another SHARP program in that summer on nuclear forensics. The most important thing, I think, is that I was appointed to the expert behavioral analysis panel by the federal district court that was set up to analyze the 2001 anthrax mailings, known as the Amerithrax investigation. And what we were asked to do was to review the entire FBI investigative file and the medical and psychiatric records of Dr. Bruce Ivins, who was a civilian microbiologist at USAMRIID, the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases and head of our anthrax vaccine program, who was believed to have been the perpetrator of the attacks. So Dr. Ivins really was the ultimate insider threat and really the most dramatic case that I've had the opportunity to work on and really delve into.
So kind of with that as the basis then, the paper that you submitted for the workshop, I think it was incredibly incisive into some of the modes that these sorts of threats take, but particularly in terms of what we were talking about more broadly, nuclear command and control. If you could maybe kind of dive into that a little bit as to how it relates and the broad spectrum of insider threats that may be out there. How does that relate to nuclear command and control in particular?
Well, they're common threats. Individuals who want to do harm will seize on whatever opportunities are available to them and best suit their purposes. We see people who join organizations with malicious intent But more often than not, these are people within organizations who then devolve and events happen in their lives, they deteriorate, they get recruited, they get radicalized. They make a decision to engage in nefarious activity, either intentionally or pose an insider threat because of negligence, indifference to policies and procedures, indifference to safety precautions. It happens in cyber, it happens in financial, it happens in medicine, it happens in law, it happens everywhere. Certainly happens in bio, it happens in chem, and it can happen in nuclear as well. So I think what we're looking at is consistent traits, shared traits in a variety of enterprises. And with regard to NC3, potentially the most devastating immediate consequences if the threat is realized.
Yeah, so you go into great detail in the paper, and I think it's worth elucidating for the listeners, those who may not yet have had the chance to read it. It's everything from, and I'll just detail some of them here, the loss of morale, diminished sense of mission, general disgruntlement. These are the things that kind of push folks, as you put it. I think some of the greatest threats to any organization and institution rise from within. You also, near the end of the paper, start talking a bit about mitigation strategies. So as you've gone through these reviews over the years and looked at the causes, what do organizations and what can nuclear-oriented organizations begin to do? We can talk about personnel reliability programs, et cetera. How do you begin to address this, and to what degree have you seen it be successful in the nuclear domain in particular?
So, interesting thing that happened was that, a number of years ago, in 2009, President Obama signed an executive order calling for the establishment of insider threat programs in all federal agencies, including Department of Defense. Prior to that, it was kind of hit or miss, but we've had personnel reliability programs around since the Cold War. And they were designed to weed out potentially problematic individuals, either people who couldn't comply or wouldn't comply, were not reliable and suitable for positions of trust, especially those, they started out in the nuclear field, the nuclear enterprise, because people handling our armaments. Problem with that, Abrams, way back, I think it was in the 80s, wrote a paper looking at the Bangor facility in Washington State, and he found 4 examples of people who were PRP certified. I think it was 2 murders, 1 suicide, and 1 murder-suicide over the course of a year. So clearly the screening mechanism, the PRP mechanism, wasn't sufficient. One of the things that's changed over the years, and with the new insider threat programs that have been stood up and things that we've done over the years in response in part to the Amerithrax situation, is a recognition that it's not just screening at the outset when somebody comes to the organization. It's not just the SF-86. It's you need to do periodic screening of people from a security standpoint, certainly, but you also have to have ongoing monitoring and support around health concerns. So certainly an occupational health approach to these situations. And then finally, encouraging people, responding to this bystander problem where people are loath to report concerns they have about coworkers.
I want to dive into that bystander problem. I want to come back to it, though. One of the things that I'll never forget was when Secretary Gates, at some point, I believe he was testifying to the SASC, was asked, and it was in the midst where there was a lot of the problems with the missileers and the reports coming out of poor behavior, et cetera. Folks were getting fired. Very senior level folks were getting removed from their positions. And he was asked, do you have confidence that everyone within the system can be trusted? And he said something to the effect of, there's nothing we can do to get to the point to where we could have that level of confidence. You should always assume that there are those in your midst that you can't trust. And it was just one of those astounding moments where you had a secretary basically pushing back and saying, no, I can't. Those PRPs have been improved over the years. I think it might be actually kind of useful for those who are out there who aren't familiar with PRPs. Would you mind going into a little bit of detail as to what a personnel reliability program actually goes into? What does it actually do?
Sure. I mean, the PRPs, personnel reliability programs, again, are focused on people's reliability over time, to be in a position of trust and suitability for that position. So it looks at, criminal background checks and all the standard stuff, but it goes beyond that and ideally goes to a very thorough vetting of the individual investigating, interviewing contacts, and then getting additional contacts from those contacts. And it's a pretty robust, and I've seen evidence that it's an increasingly robust security process. However, it occurs every 5 years on average. A lot can happen in a person's life over 5 years. Divorce, bankruptcy, all sorts of health issues, addiction. A lot of things can go bad in that time. And so really the tripwire, the frontline defense, is everybody else in the organization. It's all of us being willing to come forward and say, I'm kind of worried about Philip. He's not himself. He's acting strangely. Or I notice he's bought a Jaguar and a Bentley this week. It's people's willingness to come forward, and there are a lot. And we see this in school shooting situations. We see it in workplace shootings. We see it in counterintelligence situations. We see it everywhere, that people are reluctant to come forward because they don't want to cause trouble. They don't want to have blowback on themselves for reporting this. They don't want to destroy somebody else's career unnecessarily.
So, Ron, what kinds of insider strategies can people run to actually circumvent the monitoring, surveillance, updating of PRPs, etc.? What kind of creativity do people really show?
If you're dealing with a professional malicious insider, someone who is a dedicated spy who has decided to get inside the organization, there's probably no end to what they can do to get around those strategies. But I would say just in general, for those folks and the average insider, sort of the defeat mechanisms, you're inside. You know the organization, you know the systems. Everything from I know which guards search parcels and briefcases and bags and which ones don't. I know what time of day to come in. I know whether I can sneak a USB into a otherwise secure facility in which it's not supposed to be there and stick it into a machine and either deliver malware or take materials off, a la Edward Snowden, and Chelsea Manning. So, it's defeating guns, gates, and guards because you know where the guns, gates, and guards are, but also knowing that, as in the Ivins case, there were prox card readers. They were logging who went into the hot suites where the anthrax was handled, and the BSL 3 level work was being done. But then nobody checked them, so no one would know that he was there at all hours of the night for several weeks before the mailings happened. So it's just very clever people being able to take advantage, observe their surroundings, and take advantage of them.
These are if you like, the lone wolves, insiders in the organization. What happens if they link up with outsiders, and to what extent is that their motivation that leads to that relationship, and to what extent can the outsiders find ways to enlist insiders?
Well, I mean, it's it's the old recruitment phenomenon that intelligence services the world over use to recruit assets. People can become radicalized on their own and seek out outside groups who might want their services. People may be identified through other means and then contacted and recruited that way.
I was going to say the notorious OPM hack, which led to pretty much the entire database of then or of current POPs for roughly 20 million people? Was that right, or was it 2 million? I can't remember. It was a.
No, I think it's more it's closer to 20.
20 million of people with PRP clearances was exfiltrated from the OPM database by, it appears, someone in China. So it may be that the Chinese are running AI on the database to identify potential insiders that they might try to exploit. Is that conceivable?
Sure. You might be. I think it was like 15 million total originally identified, and it may have been around 2 million or 1.2 with PRP clearance, so that specifically. But the bottom line is, yes, we believe that information, which included lots of personal information, included financial information, included all the Social Security numbers and all the questions on the SF, Standard Form 86 requesting a security clearance. That was all taken in the OPM hack.
Right. So if you cross-reference the job status on the PRP clearance, and many of those job listings in the nuclear weapons business are actually public, we know what a particular job is called, and you find someone who has a history of problematic mental health or has potentially a major debt, you could identify those people and then attempt to exploit their vulnerability if you're a really malevolent outsider.
Absolutely. And it goes further than that, Peter, because we also have medical records that have been hacked. And we have the fact that lots of people are using, let's just say, commercially available, widely marketed DNA analyses to learn about their heritage, and that a lot of that work is being done overseas. A lot of that sequencing is being done overseas. So you have the information from the OPM hack. You have the healthcare records that have been hacked. You have access, in many cases, to genetic sequencing that can be used to identify vulnerabilities. And so a motivated actor, presumably a state actor, could indeed track down individuals working at nuclear facilities. Another problem is health records, supplements that people are using, especially military members. All of that stuff can be identified, and a lot of it, quite frankly, goes through China.
I mean, there was that famous instance of the Fitbit records of where individuals in the military and intelligence community were taking their afternoon walks all around the world, became public and was real-time data. But are there any actual instances in the sort of insider threat world in key sectors that either the nuclear sector, could be nuclear fuel cycle or nuclear weapons complex, where that kind of extortionate and blackmailing approach was taken? Or is this just hypothetical?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was one attack in the Palinda Bar in South Africa where there was a suggestion that an insider facilitated the external attack on the facility, possibly under duress. That was never actually, I think, at least publicly documented.
Yeah, I mean, all this information could be used either to seduce people, to recruit them to a cause, or, really to extort them.
Yeah, to compel them to comply. So I think we've sort of got the lay of the land as to what's going on here. It's very difficult, obviously, to defend against those kinds of threats, because particularly if they're at their managerial level, it's the managers who have the oversight function. And I was in a conference in Japan a couple of years ago where our Japanese colleagues explained to us that their nightmare scenario is actually not the external contractor, which they actually didn't have any real records of who was on site. For example, in the aftermath of the Fukushima accident, they didn't actually know who was coming on site, even though many of these workers were supplied by Yakuza or mafia-controlled entities that were supplying the workers that were passed through quickly because of radiation exposure. It actually wasn't that angle that worried them on site. It was actually the senior managers, because they would never know, and they actually don't even have a PRP system in Japan. But more to the point, there's no actual basis to even inquire about someone's mental health status in the Japanese system. Legally, there's no basis to make such an inquiry. So if you're a manager, supervisor who suspects that someone has lost the plot, you can't actually inquire legally. You have to do it informally and tacitly.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because one of the things I learned at our conference in January is that the UK doesn't have a PRP system, and they seem to be getting by just fine. The second thing I would observe is that the mental health issue is important from a reliability and suitability standpoint, not because of any relationship to malicious insider threat, because the vast majority of these people who carry out nefarious acts, they have no diagnosis, they have no evidence of mental illness. In the sense of major mental illness like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression, and things like that, certainly personality issues. In the Bruce Ivins case, he had evidence of depression and substance abuse, and he had certainly a lot of psychological problems, but what he did was not related to any psychiatric diagnosis that he had. He had other apparent motivations for this. So the fact that the Japanese don't have access to that information, there are other ways, including behavioral observations, that managers also neglect to do, that detect the risk factors that are better indicators of possible problems.
Well, given the diversity of ways that organizations deal with this insider threat, as well as the evident stresses that we've seen, the series of shocks on the American nuclear weapons organizational systems, which go all the way from the bottom of the missileers all the way to the top, where a senior Air Force general was sacked because he obviously overstepped the boundaries of what could be said in public, particularly when drunk. while he was in Russia. How do you translate this institutional problem into potential insider attacks on nuclear weapons command and control communication systems? Is there a way of figuring out where this potential threat might be most salient?
The simple thing is to say that the highest risk positions require the highest level of security, but the requirement has to be vigilance across the organization, right? And again, to return to Bruce Ivins, the shrugging off of the comments he made to coworkers, the shrugging off about his confusion and how paranoid he was at times, or his concern that the National Enquirer would have a headline one day, "Paranoid Scientist Works with Anthrax." His mistakes that he made at work, his apparent hangovers and the results of his substance abuse that people just ignored, his repeated boundary violations that people just ignored. I mean, it's that sort of vigilance that people have to mind. Once people are inside the wires, once people are in an organization, it is very easy to dismiss, and the tendency is to dismiss their, in retrospect, aberrant behavior as being, Bruce being Bruce or Robert being Robert. So you have people who fly under the radar, and because they're in the organization, there is a presumption that they are safe and secure, and so what they do is of no consequence. And that's where the cues get missed.
I think, Ron, one thing I wanted to seize on there, you mentioned seniority, and you mentioned how the more responsibility, probably the more vetting and reliability investigations might be required. I wanted to give Grace a chance to dig into the questions surrounding some of the accusations that came up around General Hayden earlier this year.
Yeah, so I was just curious that back in January, the U.S. STRATCOM published on Twitter that Air Force General John Hayden attended the workshop that we presented your report at. And in September of this year, the Senate confirmed General Hayden to be the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As you are aware, this comes after a several-month-long delay as senators weighed high-profile sexual assault allegations made by a former Hayden subordinate when he was the commanding general of the U.S. Strategic Command. The issues raised through the related hearings were also raised in Section 3 of your report and Section 4, which related to behavioral indicators of risk. What can we make of these hearings and the accusations in regards to your report on insider threats as it relates to the nuclear enterprises? And how do you see heightened risk of the nuclear enterprise, whether Hayden was guilty of the accusations or not? So just while we were formulating this question, there were some ways that we thought we could approach this, which included a toxic work environment, gender bias, and the potential for violent and malicious acts, as well as the potential lack of willingness to report behaviors or concerns on the part of co-workers. We also wanted to consider the Me Too movement impacting these dynamics and a potential of a psychoanalytical analysis of U.S. national security elites and how this environment might foster a conflict of primary emotional needs and ongoing beliefs that rationalize the use of nuclear weapons. So based off of your background and your report, I just wanted to hear kind of what your thoughts were on this and any insight that you had.
Wow. If I were on the stand, I'd say, I would hope somebody would say objection, compound question.
I guess I would.
And do you want me to address world peace at the same time? I mean, it is so complicated, Grace. So my point in writing that is that we're looking at aberrant behavior that could be a red flag for other behaviors that involve attitudes reflecting a belief that the rules don't really apply to me, or I'm above that, or anything I do is okay, right? And so it's fine. And the whole Me Too movement, absolutely. I've been involved in this field. I've been a forensic psychiatrist for 30 years. I helped the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination do videos and education on sexual harassment. I've testified in a lot of cases. We haven't nearly made the progress that one would have hoped we have made. And what's come out in recent years and months about the modern workplace is really very disconcerting. That said, it's one thing when Harvey Weinstein is a film mogul and is carrying on in the 1920s and 30s tradition of the casting couch and engaging in that behavior that's abhorrent and terrible, but it doesn't affect our national security. So if we have a character like that who is in a position of trust and responsibility, obviously that would be inappropriate. I can't speak to General Hayden's situation or what went on. I don't know the record well enough or what went on. But it's this notion of the appearance of impropriety as well as actual impropriety. So if there's an appearance of impropriety and there's enough speculation, enough comment, and enough evidence that it casts doubt on the integrity of the command structure and the orders coming from command and the reliability and suitability of either the commander or those working on the team, then it's a reasonable thing to look into. I mean, one of the stories I tell is I was giving a presentation on insider threat, and I was talking about Robert Hansen, who is the FBI agent who was in charge of the Soviet, then Russia desk at FBI headquarters, and very trusted guy and down to earth and, religious guy, devoted family man, straight arrow, kind of rigid, et cetera, et cetera. And we were talking about that as a case where, here you have the FBI, for goodness sake, and they have a traitor in their midst who's spying for the Russians. And how surprising that was, and it's an example of people, again, inside the wire. And two of the guys in the audience had worked at the FBI, and now they were security contractors for another agency. And they said, yeah, we knew Bob Hansen and never would have known. And, fabulous guy and hardworking, straight arrow, et cetera. And then a woman raised her hand and said, I'm so-and-so, I'm an FBI agent, but I started my career at the FBI as a secretary. Bob Hansen was a creep. Like, what do you mean? Said, he would engage in all this sexually inappropriate behavior, including standing in the doorway to cubicles and making women rub up against him when he got out. So there you go. I mean, in retrospect, we can say that's a big deal. But had somebody been paying more attention to that behavior, I think it'd be appropriate. Now, I don't think the rest of the people in the FBI were doing that. It is a very, especially back then, very male-dominated culture. It's one that I happen to believe, has made a lot of progress in that regard, but, we're all still working to get better on these things. It is that willingness to violate societal norms, to engage in behavior that violate boundaries, that I find of concern. Because if people are willing to violate boundaries in one realm, they'll do it in another. And I think I also told the story of a celebrity surgeon who was famous for doing the first trachea transplants. He's written up all over the world. And he also got engaged to the producer of a TV show that was being done on him by NBC, by the way. And he got engaged to her, had an affair with her while he was still married, so on and so forth. Promised that they would do this wedding at the Pope, because he helped take care of the Pope, that the Pope was going to do the wedding. It was going to be at the Pope's palace, and it was all elaborate, and these world leaders were coming. All of that was a fraud. And when the writer of that article, the Vanity Fair article on the celebrity surgeon, Adam Sarowski, came to me about this story, basically to ask me, like, who would do such a thing, get engaged in this elaborate hoax about having a wedding where the Obamas were going to be there and the Sarkozys and everybody else. And, John Legend was going to sing and Andrea Bocelli. And so we talked about that. I said, but the other thing is, we can talk about that issue. But if he's willing to do that, I'm willing to guarantee you that his CV is at least, there are holes in his CV. And so he did a lot of research. And what we found out is that there were multiple holes in his CV. He was never a full professor anywhere, but he had managed to get himself a position at the Karolinska Institute. And the other thing that came out subsequent to that, because a Swedish TV crew followed him around for a year, is that all of his patients had died, or most of his patients had died, and he had never done the large animal studies. He never got full informed consent. And the repercussions for the Karolinska Institute, the entire board resigned. They weren't going to give the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology one year. They were going to give the money to the victims of this guy to whom they'd given lab space and all this prestige. So bad people do bad things, right? And if people are willing to engage in this behavior in one realm of their lives, I think you have to be concerned they're going to do it elsewhere.
And Ron, can I follow up on that to go back to something else that you had brought up earlier, per what Grace was just talking about in terms of the knock-on effect, and you began to allude to this as well. This idea that the factors that influence colleagues, coworkers, what have you, to actually speak up as they observe risk factors. I think, regardless of what happened with General Hayden, right, the fact of the matter being is it may have a chilling effect on others to speak up, because they may see the woman who put forward her accusations, and it wasn't, it didn't slow it down, right? He was still confirmed. Can you speak a little bit to those factors that influence people as to whether they will speak up and why they wouldn't?
Well, old Japanese proverb, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down, right? So why people will do it? Seniority of the person in question and how risky it is to go up against that person. Am I really sure? If I'm not absolutely positive, should I be reporting it? What's going to happen? How reliable is the process? Will this person be treated fairly if I report it? Is the investigation going to be thorough? What's the blowback going to be on me? And my goodness, we're seeing this play out in real time. And as we record this, right, we've got this whole issue of what happens to the whistleblower. What happens to the person who takes their oath to preserve and protect the Constitution seriously and speaks up when they see something that they think is wrong? And then what happens to them? Well, in some cases, you get attacked from the very highest level, right? And so, I would call that a chilling effect. And so that's going to happen. There's a study that a couple of colleagues did in Montgomery County in Maryland. There was a program for adolescents about see something, say something, and when you should go to a spiritual leader, or a parent, or a coach, or a teacher, or someone about if you have concerns, and would you do this if someone was talking about an act of terrorism? And they all said, oh, yeah, we would do that, and that's great. And at the end of the program, they anonymously surveyed these adolescents in the community. And I forget, they surveyed like 50 or 60 of them. None of them said, surveyed anonymously, none of them would come forward. None of them. Zero. And well, why not? Well, I wouldn't want to get my friend in trouble. I wouldn't want to get myself in trouble. I wouldn't want to be wrong. I wouldn't want the friend to be angry with me. And so, they all were educated. They all nodded. They said, yep, oh yeah, we would do that. That's the right thing to do. See something, say something. And there's no way. Right. In the area of school shootings, we've made progress. Very important, in acts of mass violence, we know that 85% of people engage in what we call leakage. They actually will tell someone of their intent to do something. And so this whole bystander effect that we have to address, and we have to address it in whether it comes to bio or nuclear or workplace shootings or school shootings, is to encourage people to come forward, that it's safe for them to do so. And again, I come back to the current whistleblower phenomenon. I think we're going to be set back quite a bit given current events.
Ron, I want to go back to part of Grace's question, which I don't think you addressed.
Because it was too hard.
Well, but this is both an enormously universal question that applies to sort of all sectors where there's risk management and human behavior involved. But the question is whether there's something more nuclear specific to the kind of what Stephen Cull called in his Minds at War book at the height of the Cold War in 1988, what he called the pervasive inner conflict that affects people involved deeply with nuclear weapons. That when you're dealing with the psychic numbing day to day that comes with dealing with weapons of mass destruction, especially those at the top who are responsible, those at the bottom, in some senses, just go with the flow. They're the workhorses, and they're actually trained and disciplined to not think about the issues, just follow orders. But the people at the top actually have to think about the bigger responsibilities. And, the crux of that argument was that there is a conflict between your emotional needs and your belief structure that can really conventionalize nuclear weapons, rationalize their use, but then the inner conflict that comes from doing that cognitively does erupt. And there was this event I think it was in 2013, when an American general, Michael Carey, went to Moscow to a U.S.-Russian meeting on military cooperation. Now, he wasn't just any general. He'd been in charge of 3 or 4 wings of ICBMs. He was quite high in the nuclear operations directorate of the Joint Staff. He was at the Air Force Global Strike Command. And whilst he was in Russia, he went on a drinking binge and spent time with a couple of foreign women, was half carried across the Red Square by the Kremlin by his staff. He tried to perform with a band at a Moscow bar called La Cantina. And on the way home in Zurich in transit, he got drunk and started raving about his position as the commander of nuclear forces, which he saves the world from being used every day. And so he was, of course, cashiered. He was investigated and removed. But this suggests it's not just a cultural malaise or a security lapse at stake. There's something going on with the psychodynamics with nuclear weapons. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on how that might play out on the insider side of the threat.
So, what you're describing is a pretty classic example of a security breach by someone who gets hammered. And, not knowing this person, we can wax eloquent about, hypothetical psychodynamic factors. I think at the root of this, it's a very important guy, a very important position, a lot of responsibility. The stress of that position may well have contributed to his drinking and his excessive drinking and his disinhibition and his desire to impress the people around him. I don't know who was around him at the time that he might wanted to impress, but I'm a big deal. Let me talk to you about what I do and how important I am. And so, we see that, right? And it sounds like he, kind of scored an own goal on this one rather than being seduced by Russian operatives, but that can also be the case. Let me get you another vodka, and another, unless they were drinking margaritas at the La Cantina.
Well, the Inspector General's report never actually determined whether the women were honeypots set in motion by Russian operatives or if they were just women working the bar. That was left undetermined in the IG report, which incidentally readers can look up. It's easy to find the report. It's pretty astounding.
So, what I would say is that certainly people with those positions of authority in the nuclear enterprise would be as susceptible and perhaps more susceptible to those sort of failings, those breaches, when, the stress of the situation, the importance of what they do would lead them to blurt out. And have these conversations with people who, people don't do their best thinking when they're drinking. And so it's one of the reasons.
So you're suggesting it's sort of more of a mundane failure than a psychodrama to do with the psychological weight, the burden that you carry when you're managing nuclear weapons. And
I think it's a surprisingly mundane, banal situation. It's normative. And people do stupid stuff when they get that drunk. The stress of that situation can certainly contribute to that and certainly would form the substance of the breach.
I think based off of that, I just had one follow-up question regarding what you were saying about violating boundaries and societal norms and behavior that's more violent in nature. If that becomes normalized and becomes a societal norm within this type of workplace environment, would it reduce kind of the emotional and rationalized needs that we need of these national security elites when making the decision of launching a nuclear weapon? And as we're engaging these emerging technologies, whether it's like automated processes or whatnot within some of these different command structures, I just didn't know if this environment that we're fostering or could potentially foster would take a toll on decision makers and their ability to make an emotional, rationalized decision.
So I would say that is a symptom more than an effect. So the boundary violations are a product of the culture. So you have a culture that allows these things to go on where they are ignored, and whether it's excessive drinking or whether it's inappropriate social relations between colleagues or across levels of the chain of command, right? So that is symptomatic. I think when we're talking about the risk here, the misuse of these materials, of these weapons, is so extreme, is so abhorrent, that it's going to take a long time for people to get there. People do compartmentalize, right? But you have to look at a situation where somebody has the motivation to make use of them, which would have to be extreme. They have to have the capability. They have to have access to it, have to be able to manipulate it, and then to carry it out on a long-term basis. So usually this starts out with a grievance of some sort, and then people move on, and that's part of their motivation to go out. But
I think where she was heading was, there is one insider who is not subject to the two-person rule, which is that pretty much on everything involving handling and firing nuclear weapons, two people have to sign off and act on an authenticated order. That's one of our fundamental negative controls to ensure that we never misuse nuclear weapons or fire them by mistake.
Mm-hmm.
There's one person in the system to whom that rule does not apply in the American NC3 system, which is the Supreme Commander, the President. And at the moment, I think it's fair to say that this president is breaking many of the standard procedures, language, vocabulary, rules, norms, in ways that is giving permission to many people, at least in their perception, to break the rules that relate to them, and that this cascades outwards into the society at large and downwards through the command hierarchies and puts those hierarchies under some stress. And we see this now playing out in the debate in Washington as to whether that rule should be of two persons at minimum should be now applied to the decision to use nuclear weapons rather than just leaving it to be the sole choice of the president.
Yeah, at the workshop, we were talking about emerging techs that will impact strategic command and control in 5, 10, so many years like down the road. And so if we're fostering an environment now, when we get to those decisions where we're integrating emerging tech, whether it is with the president or just in a different form of command, if we're promoting an environment that when we make these decisions down the road, we'll become more neutralized and not be able to make emotional, rationalized decisions.
But sure, bad behavior from the top of the command is going to trickle down. Does it lead to indifference? I honestly think it could. I don't know that it's going to lead to use of these weapons. However, increased bellicosity, increased aggression, lack of attention to analytic thinking and critical thinking, is that contagious? I don't know that it would be. My greater concern, actually, if I can slightly shift gears here, is the increase in right-wing extremism in this country, particularly in the military. The fact that the people who are guarding our arsenals are, part of that contingency, and that it's well documented about the growth of right-wing extremism in the United States. There have been concerns about it in the military for a very long time. Recently published book, and I'm blocking the name of it, but it's about, I can get that for you, about basically right-wing extremism growing in the military and veterans after Vietnam, and all the motivations and influences that led to that. So these are the people, right? The people in our military, these are our missileers. These are the people who are guarding the silos. They're handling the materials. In our increasingly bellicose environment and our fractious political climate domestically, not just internationally, but domestically, I have concerns about someone who falls prey to that influence and hears some of the language coming from the highest levels of government about civil war and things like that. That really concerns me. The people who have access to these materials may at some point be persuaded that now is the time to act, to protect what they see as our way of life. And so it's well established that right-wing extremism is really the greatest threat in terms of domestic terrorism here in the U.S. And those are my big concerns.
And it's only getting worse at this point. That leads me to, if I could pull on that thread a little bit further, and going back to one of the first questions we asked you, which was mitigation strategies. We've talked a little bit about how technology may facilitate the ability of malicious actors to, take advantage of witting or unwitting agents within an organization. How can technology maybe, in the way that you see things headed, be used to solve some of these problems? And obviously, those are going to be double-edged swords with the tracking, surveillance elements of some of these novel technologies that are out there. They're going to be used for those kinds of purposes. But if you can set up a camera in a town square that tracks people's gait and identifies who's up to no good and who's not, what role does some of these novel technologies play in maybe identifying some of the behavioral trends that you were just talking about? And in that same question, what sort of new problems might that create over time, those technologies being integrated?
Yeah, We're not there yet in terms of the AI. Everybody's counting on AI and machine learning to solve all of our previously unsolved problems, especially around violence risk assessment. We're a long way from that. First of all, these are low incidence phenomenon, so you have very small sample sizes on which to work. If you're going to do machine learning to develop, profiles of, and I know people talk about eye movements and gait and, all sorts of things like that, heart rate, you have to have a sample size to train on, so you have to find a sufficiently large pool of people who have engaged in the acts that you're trying to prevent and then train the machine on those. And even if you were to do an unsupervised machine learning model, there's just not enough material for the machines to work on. But that doesn't mean people aren't trying to sell this. I mean, people are selling this stuff for monitoring social media. In fact, I think Senator Cornyn just wrote this into a requirement into some bill about response to school violence and mass violence, that school districts are required to monitor social media and analyze it. And I've actually done some work on computational linguistics and threats against judges. And it just doesn't, it picks up on abnormalities, but doesn't pick up necessarily identify actual threats. So you have a small sample size. You have the question of availability of even subjects within that sample size to train your model on. It's all highly speculative and likely doomed to fail, although it's sort of a neat idea, and it's worth looking at that, especially some of the linguistic assessment stuff. But we're just not there yet.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting elements there, and I want to give Peter a chance to jump back in here again in case he has additional questions, but one of the interesting elements there, you just began to speak to it, is the anomaly detection.
Yep.
And so with the paucity perhaps of data that's necessary to begin to pick up on who may be heading in particular directions, you can at least find a way to take the data you've got and establish the norms and then look for aberrant patterns within that. To a certain extent, it's something that we've talked about, not just in terms of human behavior, person to person, but just in terms of how, equipment can get moved around or what have you. There's ways to figure out how states are behaving by using systems for those purposes.
Sure. And I think, by the way, that in terms of predicting who's going to be violent, who's going to be a traitor, who's intending an act of terror, I think there are behavioral indicators. I think the Israelis are really very good at screening people at airports, and there are those models. But that requires, in-person examination and observation of people. So I think, those AI models of predicting human behavior are probably long down the road, and I don't know that we actually want to live in a world where we're all being analyzed to that extent. On the other hand, the folks in cyber have done a really pretty good job of looking at what systems you're allowed to have access to and which ones you access. So those especially in the NC3 world, I think are important, because if I'm allowed to be in this system and not in these two other systems, and then suddenly you see that my identifier is linked in there, it pops up, that's a problem. However, you have to make sure that other people aren't giving me their password. Right, so that requires policies and procedures and educating people on the importance of those procedures and how damaging it is to try and to allow other people to defeat them. And it requires that somebody actually be looking at the data.
Ron, I want to go back to complexity and organizations, because we've been talking about insiders with volition who can then exploit their environment in ways that controvert the mission and create danger for not only the organization, but for the whole world by potentially setting in motion events that could lead to nuclear war. But part of the problem with complex big organizations is that they have cybernetics that no one really understands, feedback loops, organizational dynamics. And so this is really a two-part question. The first part is, how do you design a system to deal with really motivated humans who want to do the right thing, but inadvertently defeat the controls that are precisely there to stop them from doing the wrong thing? And the example I have in mind was one that was discovered in the 1970s, which was that the two officers or missileers in a silo in the American military have a two-key system where they get an order, they authenticate it, and then they both have to turn a key at the same time for the missile to actually lift off and fire out of the silo, after which you can't recall it. So that is the sort of ultimate protection, if you like, against loss of control of the weapon by an individual. Well, what the missileers figured out was that if someone went mad or decided to disobey their order, they were so committed to their mission that they were ready to disable or kill the party who was refusing to turn the key, and they invented a physical way to turn both keys with one person. And this had been going on for some time before it was discovered by a journalist who visited a silo and sat down in the cafeteria with the missileers just talking about their lives. And this came up and the Air Force corrected it. So, in spite of the best efforts to set up a control system to stop inadvertent launch, highly motivated, creative individuals found ways to defeat it. How do you even begin to anticipate and guard against that kind of dynamic?
I think the best you can do is through education and training. So first of all, making sure you hire the best possible people for that, which is an increasing challenge, I think, and emphasizing that the potential consequences of that. Now, in that case, it sounds like they thought the potential consequences are that they wouldn't be able to launch when they wanted to launch and strike their target.
That's correct.
So it has to do with education and training on what is the mission. And the mission is not just to destroy the target when the target needs to be destroyed, but that all these other policies and procedures are essential to doing that in the proper way.
Well, I guess one point is that technological and hardware controls and even software controls actually present new opportunities for creative humans to innovate and work around. There really is no ultimate technological surefire solution. It's really going to go back to how the individuals are managed and trained and, in fact, monitored over time. And then the second part of this question is we've basically treated all insiders as threats. But not all insiders are threats. They may, in fact, save the organization from itself. Can you speak to that? I mean, we've talked about whistleblowers as one form of that, but there are others who go outside standard operating procedure to actually save the day. I mean, there are real-world examples of that. So it's not as if standard operating procedures and training can always work well for the organization.
Yeah, I do. I agree. My mind goes right back to the whole whistleblower problem. The whistleblower is essential in that situation, right? The person who's going to come forward and stop what.
Yeah, but I'm actually not thinking of the whistleblower. I'm thinking of the individual who has equally deep insight into the potential failings of the system because they're incredibly competent and they're highly trained and they're highly motivated to avoid failure of the system. And then they see it failing and they break procedure because they understand it better than their superiors. The famous example is the Russian who had all this early warning data flooding in that the Soviet Union was under attack. Sorry, he was then a Soviet citizen. And he figured out that almost certainly it was an early warning system error generated by the satellites and the semi-automated early warning system, and he chose to not alert the entire Soviet command hierarchy and possibly save the world from inadvertent nuclear war. So that's an example of where an individual puts themselves at risk in order to save the whole organization from itself.
Yeah, and they're either then heroes or goats.
He was pretty much put out to pasture and punished for doing the right thing for the rest of his life, I should add.
Yeah, I think that scenario what you're describing emphasizes just how risky this whole enterprise is. That the fate of the world may turn on the judgment and the willingness for self-sacrifice of one individual. It's kind of mind-blowing.
That's a scary thought, Ron.
Yeah.
On that happy note, Ron, you've given us a great deal of your time. We really, again, appreciate you participating in January, but also doing this conversation with us.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Thanks again, Ron. As always, thanks to our listeners. We'll be back next week with yet another episode of The Fourth Leg. Check it out. Until then, subscribe to the pod via SoundCloud, or we'll see you online. Ping us on Twitter, shoot us a note. Till then, thanks to everyone for listening. Look forward to hearing from you.